Greetings, all. This is Rick Levine with your astrology forecast for April of 2021. And before we get into the nitty gritty of the month, I have a couple of quick announcements to make. One is that this Saturday on April 3rd, I will be doing an ISAR, that's the International Society for Astrological Research. I will be doing an ISAR intensive, and it will be from 12 noon to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That's from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Time. And this will be a hands-on kind of rock and roll few hours of improving client sessions where the planets meet the Earth. And in it, I kind of talk about the ongoing dance between astrology techniques and actually applying them in our work with clients. And it's an in-depth analysis, and actually we'll be doing some hands-on with some charts of participants, and it's a really good way to hone our consultation skills. If you're interested in finding out more about this or registering it for it, um, you can go to isarastrology.org and scroll down to the section on ISAR intensives. The cost is less if you're a member of ISAR, but you can either join to get the better price or just pay the one-time shot if you want to take the class. And that is on Saturday, April 3rd. Okay, that's first thing. Second thing is a short reminder that the 37th annual NORWAC, and NORWAC is the Northwest Astrological Conference, and the 37th NORWAC will be occurring on May 27th through the 31st. This is Memorial Day weekend, and this will be a virtual conference like it was last year. NORWAC last year was amazing. It was all online, and they pulled it off in a way that I've not seen an online conference. I will be doing 2 lectures as part of that conference, and it's norwac.net. That's NORWAC.net, NET. And check that out, and I will see you there. If you attend, I will see you there virtually. And it's quite a weekend with quite a lineup of astrologers from all around the world. And you can get on their mailing list and find out about other astrological events and classes that are done in the Pacific Northwest. That's it. I said 2 quick things. We are done with that part of the show, and now on to April. So April is an intriguing month because there's a lot of forward motion. I think that ultimately we will look back at March and April of 2021 and see kind of motion away from whatever the craziness was in 2020. We are not out of the woods yet. For those of you who have been following these monthlies on a regular basis, you know that the Capricorn cluster from 2020 has really turned into a slightly different issue for 2021. And that is an issue of the Saturn having moved into Aquarius, squaring Uranus, which is in Taurus. And a lot of this year is this dance between the conservative status quo, traditional, hold on to what we have, go back to the past, Saturn, versus the Uranus plow into the future, the progressive, the revolutionary energy, the innovative energy, and that would be Uranus. And yet the odd thing is that Saturn is in futuristic Aquarius, which is in modern astrology, it's the home sign for Uranus. and Uranus is in the sign of Taurus, which doesn't necessarily like a whole lot of change. And so there's this dance going on all year, and Uranus actually squares Pluto 3 times during the year. The first time occurred back on February 17th. The second time will occur on June 14th. And the third time, and the third and final time, will occur on December 23rd, although the square gets very close again in the autumn of 2022. So we're not going to be done with this conflict, the Saturn-Uranus square conflict, really until we get pretty much through 2022. But what's important to know about this month, about April, is that although the Saturn Uranus square is not exact this month, again, it was exact in mid February and will be exact again on the Saturn retrograde. It'll be exact again in mid June. Right now, I say right now, meaning April 1st, this is being recorded early in the morning on April 1st, that on April 1st, Saturn at 11.5 degrees of Aquarius is basically 2 degrees, really 1.5 degrees. It's about 2.5 degrees of orb from Uranus, which is at 9 degrees of Taurus. So 9, 10, 11, and a half. It's a 2.5 degree orb square, which is still within orb, meaning that this conflict that has kind of fired up at the beginning of the year when Saturn really in December of 2020, when Saturn entered Aquarius, this square is still with us. It's with us and will remain with us. But this month, in April, what we're going to see is as planets move from Pisces and Aries into Taurus, what's going to happen is that we're going to get a series of planets that will conjoin Uranus in early degrees at 9 degrees of Taurus and square Saturn at about 11.5 degrees, although it'll move on a little bit, 11.5 degrees of Aquarius. And so what we're going to get is, and I'm just giving a little bit of foreshadowing for the month, because this is, I think, going to be the main dynamic of the month that kicks off on April 1st. Isn't that interesting? The month of April starts on the 1st this year. I'm kidding. That right on the 1st, we have Mercury forming a half square with Saturn. And that Mercury half square Saturn kind of heightens that sense of stress, the holding back energy of Saturn. And then on April 19th, we have Mars making a square and a half with Saturn. And then on April 24th and 25th, we have Venus and Mercury both squaring Saturn. So that's the Saturn side of the equation. Now, the other side of that is that in mid-April, on April 14th, we have Mars making a half square with Uranus. This is electric. This is destabilizing. This is something happens unexpected, and it certainly can be physical, but it's an erratic energy that breaks through. That's on April 14th. And then Venus, Mercury, and the Sun, one by one, moving through Taurus, will line up with Uranus. Venus lines up with Uranus on the 22nd, and then it squares Saturn on the 24th. Mercury lines up with Uranus on the 23rd, and it squares Saturn on the 25th. And then the Sun lines up with Uranus on the 30th, and it squares Saturn in the first few days of May. But in each of these cases, we have planets that are rattling either electric futuristic breakthrough, lightning-like awareness, spontaneous excitement, and an expressive, irrepressible expression of Uranus, and then followed up almost immediately by the clamping down and the pulling back of Saturn. So this is interesting because we're getting the Uranus first and then the Saturn. Well, maybe not so much. And so this is going to be a theme of how April moves along. And I think what we'll see through the month is breakthroughs or new expressions that kind of push us into new places, and then some negotiation and pulling back and coming to a place that isn't maybe quite as revolutionary, progressive, explosive, destabilizing as it might have seemed at first, and instead actually grounds it a bit in reality. So I think this is kind of a backdrop theme of the month. Another thing about this month, about April, is that since Mercury turned direct back toward the end of February, I believe, all the planets have been moving direct. By the end of April, we get the first of the outer planets that are turning retrograde. That begins a slow process through the end of April, May, and June, where the outer planets one at a time turn retrograde. This begins with Pluto turning retrograde on April 27th, followed by Saturn turning retrograde on May 23rd, and then Jupiter turning retrograde on June 20th, followed by Neptune on June 25th, and then Chiron on July 15th, and then Uranus on August 19th. So what we have is a cascading, almost like a waterfall of the outer planets turning retrograde, first Pluto, then Saturn, then Jupiter, Neptune, Chiron, and Uranus, each almost a month apart. There's a couple that happen more quickly in June. In June, there's Jupiter turns retrograde, followed by Neptune just a few days later. But what that means is that through April, we're still going to be feeling forward motion. We're feeling like we're moving into new ground. And this, of course, is stacked onto the concept that on the spring equinox, the vernal equinox in the Northern Hemisphere, that that the Aries energy is actually very strong, and that Aries energy is about new. It's about pushing into new places. It's about the ram with the horns head first, butting against the walls and pushing them down and moving into new places. The Aries energy is about the exploration of unexplored territory. It's about doing things that have never been done. Aries energy certainly can be headstrong and impulsive, but we have Saturn still acting as a bit of an anchor, and especially as the planets square Saturn once they move into Taurus, we'll be feeling some of that restraint. However, the month starts off with a kick. Let's bring up the charts and move through the month, and away we go. As always, we are looking at a natural horoscope wheel with 0 degrees of Aries rising, with whole sign houses, so that each house is associated with its natural house. So that if we look at the second house, it's Taurus, and the third house, the third sign, Gemini, and so on. And although I say this at the beginning of most of my forecasts, the reason I do this is that it's just silly to look at a chart for a location, because you who are viewing this from my neighborhood near Seattle. You're viewing it from New York, from Atlanta, Georgia, from London, from Abu Dhabi, from Sydney. You're all over the world. And so it's foolhardy to use a chart and to use it with my location just because this is where I am. The fact of the matter is that the charts that we'll be looking at, unless I tell you otherwise, are for 12 noon Pacific Daylight Time, which means that when you adjust for your time zone correction, the chart that you're looking at will be the chart where you are, but there's no horizon in it. If you want to look at it through a horizon, you'll have to recreate the chart with an actual ascendant and midheaven. But when we look at the chart for 12 noon Pacific Daylight Time on April 1st, we can see that the month begins with the moon in Sagittarius. By the way, for those of you who are new, I use fairly simple aspects for most of the forecasting work, meaning that I'm using Ptolemaic aspects, including quincunxes and semi-sextiles. Although I have to admit, I lean on quincunxes more than the semi-sextiles. They appear in green. In the chart we're looking at, there are none of those right now. Um, the um, the red lines are either squares or oppositions. The blue lines are either sextiles or trines. And the orange lines are either half squares, that's a semi-square or an octile, and they're sesqui-squares or square and a halves, or is that squares and a half? I think it's square and a halves. Sesqui-squares or trioctiles. And so those are the aspects that I'm using in these charts. And unless we're looking at the chart around the full moon, I like to leave the aspect lines from the moon off because we're really looking at the major patterns. We might know where the moon is, but the aspects for the moon change so rapidly through the day that it's beyond the level of granularity that we're looking at in these forecasts. However, we do note that on April 1st, we begin the month with Chiron, the Sun, and Venus all clustered moving toward mid degrees of Aries, and the moon in mid Sagittarius moving toward the south node, that we're getting a play on April 1st of the moon in Sagittarius trining Chiron, the Sun, and Venus, which theoretically should be a bit of uplifting. And I imagine that it will be uplifting, except we also have Mercury in the play here quite strongly, because Mercury is forming a half square with Saturn. Mercury, toward the end of Pisces, is forming a 45-degree semi-square with Saturn. And that might make us feel like we've run into an intellectual or rational wall. We may feel stuck. We may even feel um, what's the right word? We may feel like we're fighting an uphill battle, that someone's thinking is rigid, or it may be our thinking that's rigid. Either way, this is about needing to change our perspective, or at least open up our mind so we don't get stuck by that, facing that resistance of Saturn. And the good news is that Mercury is also forming a sextile with Pluto. And you can see at noon, the Mercury is at 25 degrees, 55 minutes of Pisces, and Pluto is at 26 degrees and 39 minutes of Capricorn. So that's less than a degree away from being exactly sextile. And in fact, the sextile occurs at 11 o'clock p.m. Pacific time, which of course would be 2 a.m. On April 2nd on the East Coast, and later in the morning in Western Europe. The point is that although we have the uplifting energy of the Sagittarius kind of cavalier, let's go for it, moon that's trining all that Aries energy, we do have a little bit of a heavier weight that's coming from the contemplative and sensitive Mercury in Pisces, that's impacted both by austere, stern taskmaster Saturn and metamorphosis, the metamorphosis and transformation of Pluto. And so we definitely have some work to do on the first that I think will lead us in the right direction. But Mercury is moving pretty fast right now. And if we move this chart ahead a couple of days, actually, this occurs later on the third, but I'm going to move it to the fourth. But we're watching Mercury go from 29 degrees of Pisces to 1 degree of Aries. Now, Mercury's moving almost 2 degrees a day right now. It's buzzing along. So you can see just overnight, it moves from, well, in 2 days, from April 2nd, it moves from late 27 degrees of Pisces to 1 degree of Aries. And now what we can see beginning on late on April 3rd, what we can see is that we now have 4 planets in Aries. And if you remember, going back to late last year in November, December, we had a pileup of planets in Capricorn, and then that energy shifted from Capricorn into Aquarius, and through late January and into February, we had a pileup of planets in Aquarius. And then through last month in March, we had those planets all, I say those planets, I really mean the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, but we also had Neptune in Pisces. And so there were 4 planets moving through Pisces, with the moon kind of sweeping through there around the new moon. And now we have Mercury, Chiron, the Sun, and Venus all in Aries, all saying there is creation, there is new, there is excitement, there is enthusiasm, but there is also resistance. And remember that resistance is going to be there, which is the Saturn square Uranus all year, but it becomes more exaggerated as we move through the month of April, and we will see that occurring in just a few minutes. Another thing to just make a mental note of is that with these 4 planets in Aries and a feeling that we're moving into new territory, or that we've entered new territory, that that we're having to make stuff up as we go along, which is not a bad thing. We actually have to create new, because the old is about yesterday, and here we are, and we're in a new environment, and that can be very exciting, but it also can be overwhelming for some people, and some people don't deal with change and with newness and with spontaneity as easily as other people do. So we need to keep that in mind, but we need to also just be aware that that moon in Capricorn on the 4th, which is moving towards its conjunction with Pluto, that the moon over the days ahead will move through Aquarius and then Pisces. And by April 11th, the moon, by the 10th, the moon will move into Aries. And by the 11th, we will have a new moon in Aries with 5 planets in Aries. And that will be the moon and Mercury and Chiron and the Sun and Venus. And this can be very exciting. And it also can be, like I said, a bit daunting, a bit overwhelming, because things seem to be happening really fast. Things are moving really fast with all these planets in Aries. So that takes us through the 4th. And then we get to April 6th, which is my birthday. April 6th is an intriguing day this year, because we have Venus forming an exact sextile with Mars. At midday, it shows Venus at 20 degrees, 10 minutes of Aries, with Mars at 19 degrees, 56 minutes of Gemini. And so we can see that the exact sextile between Venus and Mars really occurred earlier in the morning, and that would have been at about 4 a.m. Pacific time. But here we have quite a nice balance, a cooperation between the lovers, between the cosmic lovers, between the I like and I'm going to get, or between the my values are this, and that's Venus, and here's how I'm going to establish boundaries and or assert my need to maintain those values, that's Mars. And Venus and Mars, when they are in harmonious relationships like a sextile, they can be very creative. It can be, it's a nice relief, and we'll be able to feel that on the 6th. Also on the 6th, we have another aspect that might be a bit more subtle, but I think it's important, and that is that Jupiter is making a half square with Chiron. And remember, half squares are kind of like squares. They're typically not easy. They're conflictive, but they're also creative. They're dynamic. And the half square or semi square between Jupiter and Chiron, I think, is a an acknowledgement of what we need to do beyond what we thought we needed to do in order to reach some semblance of healing or forgiveness or some peaceful state of mind, because when Jupiter and Chiron get together in any form, they're always in some way projecting hope that would be Jupiter onto the solution of the incurable problems or illnesses or worries of Chiron. And so during this semi square, we might have issues that come to the forefront, and thankfully the Venus sextile Mars, I believe, will help us move through this without a lot of difficulty. On the 7th and 8th, we have seventh on the 7th and 8th. God, say that 3 times fast. We have a couple of semi sextiles between Venus and Neptune and Mercury and Uranus. I don't lean very heavily on the semi sextiles by mundane transit, unless they are at degrees that are um, ticking off or resonating to planets in your own natal chart. And if that happens, then I think there's more significance. So if you do have planets at that 21 degree or the 9 degree area, that aspect of those aspects might in fact um, uh, be felt. And typically a semi-sextile is kind of felt like a quincunx. It's usually an annoyance or an irritation. A lot of people think of semi-sextiles as half sextiles, which are half trines, and therefore semi-sextiles must work like sextiles, but they don't, because they are so sharp. There's a difference between signs that are in next door neighbor signs, and the semi-sextiles can be a bit annoying. The thing, though, is that Mercury is also conjuncting Chiron. Remember, on the 6th, we had Jupiter making a half square with Chiron. And so what we have now is Mercury making a half square with Jupiter as Mercury lines up with Chiron. And so I think here what we're running into is the importance of communication as a methodology, as a way to deal with what ails us. Whether this is talk therapy, whether this is talking things out with a friend, a lover, a business partner, a spouse, a parent, or a child, I think there's an ability to gain traction and move through some difficult issues if we're willing to take the risk and actually bring the subject up and out into the open. The other thing about April 9th, though, is that things can get a bit weird or a bit confusing because Mars, let's move this ahead. We're still sitting back here on the 6th. That as we get to the 8th and 9th, we can see that the square between Mars and Neptune, that line thickens. And I didn't say this earlier, but those of you who have worked with me for a while know that in the charts that I use, as aspects approach 0 degree orb, as they get closer and closer to exact, the lines get very thick. So what we can see here is that on April 9th, Mars is making a square with Neptune from 21 Gemini to 21 Pisces. And in fact, earlier in the day, in the mid-late morning on April 9th, again, that's Pacific time, the moon will be lining up with or conjoining Neptune in Pisces. And so it's a bit of a double whammy because we're not just having a Mars squaring Neptune, we're having Mars squaring a Moon-Neptune conjunction. And I think that this can be a bit confusing because I think our energy doesn't express physically, that would be Mars, in the way that we imagine, that would be Neptune. It's a square. There's a bit of dynamic conflict between the Mars in Gemini that doesn't want to be tied down, that wants to do this and do that, and can be distracted, that Mars in Gemini is adaptable and certainly can be a jack of all trades, although it sacrifices that it may end up being a master of none. And its square to Neptune can be a bit delusional or a bit confusing, and whether we end up misleading ourselves or we end up misleading someone else or someone else ends up misleading us, there's the potential to superimpose a fantasy, an illusion onto reality. I think it was Aeneas Nin who said, we don't see what's out there, we see what's in here. In other words, we see reality through the filter of our sense organs. And I think that that's particularly true with Neptune and with Pisces, and especially with the moon conjuncting Neptune in Pisces, and it's exacerbated by the fact that Mars is squaring it. So I think April 9th is going to be an intriguing day that actually the energy resolves pretty quickly, because by the time we get to the 10th, that square between Mars and Neptune begins to wane. The energy begins to spread, and we become a lot more focused on what is right now. Once the moon moves into Aries, actually late on the late on the evening of the 9th. But by the time we get to the 10th, the moon is solidly in Aries, and it will be on the 11th at 7:30 p.m. Pacific time that the moon actually catches up with the sun, and we have that new moon in Aries. Now, the new moon in Aries is a special new moon because we astrologers tend to say that the spring equinox, the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere, is the beginning of the astrological new year. Why? Because the sun moves into the first sign of the zodiac, the cycle starts anew, and the sun moving into Aries is the beginning of the yearly solar cycle. Well, by the same token, we can say that the first new moon in Aries is kind of like a higher frequency imprint on that new year. And so we're in an interesting place on the 9th and the 10th, because the moon is in Aries. All these planets are in Aries. We're blasting ahead. We're not taking no for an answer. We're pushing toward what our goals are. We're kind of, overcoming whatever the odds are. We're not taking any prisoners. God, the song by Cake, Short Skirt, Long Jacket, comes to mind. She's moving through the factory, cutting through red tape with a machete, taking, no slack. That image is very much an image of that Aries energy. And yet, until the new moon, we're really finishing up the old, because it's the dark of the moon. It's the balsamic phase of the moon. And so it's kind of a peculiar position where we're like a thoroughbred horse in the starting gate, ready for the race, where everything is set, the race, the time is now, and nothing happens. And we're waiting. And there's this kind of dead air space. that can become quite uncomfortable. And so interestingly enough, the moon is also conjoining Chiron during this period of time and lining up with Mercury. Again, the importance of communication in dealing with what are emotional, self-critical or critical of others. That whole feeling function is wrapped up in that moon Chiron, Mercury, all this newness of this Aries energy as we're coming into and toward the new moon on the 11th. But on the 10th, we have that Mercury, Mercury at 12 degrees of Aries, making a sextile with Saturn at 12 degrees of Aquarius. And this is kind of giving us the signal that even though we're ready to start, we can use an extra few hours or even an extra day by kind of fine tuning our plans, by rehearsing our scripts, by practicing whatever our routines are. There's this sense of we have almost like a day of getting it right and working on our stuff while we're getting the support from Saturn to that Mercury in Aries that wants nothing else other than to get on with the show. But because it's a sextile, it's actually taking Saturn's constructive criticism and Saturn's sense that if you just slow down a little bit, you'll actually get further than you want to go. And or further than you thought you would be able to go. So this is a very powerful sextile on the dark of the moon. And on top of that, we have a second sextile from Venus. And Venus also in Aries, but toward the end of Aries, is making a sextile with Jupiter. So if you think about it, we have Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius, Saturn at 12 and Jupiter at 25 Aquarius, kind of toward the middle of Aquarius and the end of Aquarius. And then we have Mercury at 12 degrees of Aries and Venus at 25 degrees of Aries. And the Venus, the Mercury and the Venus, I think I might have said that backwards, the Mercury at 12 degrees of Aries and Venus at 25 degrees of Aries are both making, they're mutually sextiling Saturn and Jupiter respectively, which is kind of giving us a really sweet balance between the Jupiter. I like the idea of growing. I like Venus. My values include saying yes to the possibilities of what's going on now. That's Venus sextile Jupiter. And yet, my intellect tells me that if I slow down and don't push too hard, too fast, if I don't push prematurely out of the starting gate, I'll actually be more ready. I'll be more able to take advantage of the liftoff, of the blast off that occurs at the new moon, which occurs at 7:30 p.m. on April 11th. Here we are looking at a chart for 7:30 p.m., and that's Pacific Daylight Time, on April 11th, 2021. And we can see that the sun and the moon are both at 22 degrees of Aries and 25 minutes. Actually, the moon here shows at 24 minutes, but it's within 1 arc minute of being exact. So it just might have been later. If we moved this ahead by 1 minute of Earth time, we would probably pick up that there. Now they're both at 22 degrees and 25 minutes. But the significant thing about, well, there's a few significant things about this particular new moon. The first is that it's rather beautifully situated because we have Mars at 23 degrees of Gemini moving toward a trine to Jupiter at 25 degrees of Aquarius. And that Mars trine to Jupiter is exact on the 16th. So we're 4 days away from it being exact. But it's only, a little bit over 2 degrees of orb from being exact. But the new moon at 22.5 degrees is actually that the both the sun and the moon are moving toward sextiles with Mars and with Jupiter. And so the sun makes a sextile with Mars on the 13th and with Jupiter on the 15th. And the moon makes sextiles with both of them within just a few hours of the new moon itself. And so what we're doing is we're getting an early foreshadowing of the exuberance of the thrusting ahead, of the physicality of Mars trine Jupiter, which is often seen. The image of Mars trine Jupiter is someone winning a sporting event, where there can be combat, but it doesn't have to be physical, aggressive combat. It's kind of like expanding. That's not the word I'm looking for. It's extending the capabilities of the body, of the mind, of the spirit, so that it can take advantage of the power of positive thinking and convert that into, that would be Jupiter, and convert that into action, that would be Mars. And this new moon in Aries is sitting right at the middle of all of that. And so it's quite a beautiful little construction that we see there. However, and there's always the however, we have a partile, an exact square between Venus and Pluto, and that Venus-Pluto square is so close that it occurs, it's exact within less than 50 minutes of Earth time, within an hour of the new moon itself, that Venus is exactly square Pluto. And this takes everything and pushes it 2 or 3 notches deeper. This tells us that there's stuff going on that is not quite visible. It's not on the surface. There are forces lurking in the shadows. If you're a conspiracy theorist, man, this is a time to, spin those possibilities, because there are, eyeballs coming out of the manhole covers as you walk by, and they're watching you from behind. There's there's a bit of a sense of depth and intensity, of emotionality. It's Venus is in Aries. I mean, all this energy in Aries is about the expression of energy in the moment, and we don't think of this as an emotional energy, but there is some emotionality to it, because it's passion, it's power, it's physical, and it's Venus is there, so it's moving toward what it's attracted to. And the moon is there, it's caring, it's nurturing. But even not only is Venus exactly square to Pluto, but the new moon itself is, for all practical purposes, square Pluto. Again, it's 4 degrees away from being exact, but that means that the moon will square Pluto within 8 hours of the actual new moon, and the sun will square Pluto on the 16th, just a few days later. So this energy has a lot of power and a lot of potential, but it also has a trap, and the trap is getting caught up in a battle or a struggle for dominance, for control, with an energy larger than yourself that simply may not be controllable. There, there are times to hold and there's times to fold, And I'm not saying that we should just give up and walk away from anything, but I think we really need to be careful about what battles we are choosing to fight, and what are worth following through on, and what might be better to just let the energy settle for a little bit, and then take it at a more opportune time, where our expression won't stir up so much resistance right away, because there's a lot of resistance here that is ready to come to the surface that really doesn't need to. I don't think it serves any direct purpose, although we are getting enough support from the sextiles from the new moon to Jupiter and to Mars. and the and the upcoming Mars trine Jupiter too, that if those energies are stirred up, I think we have the sense to be able to work with them rather than just, detonating something to a level that kind of makes it unrecoverable. Now, what's that saying is like when there's no undo key for something that we say. And so I think that the most important thing here, because of all this impulsive energy, is just to pay attention to what we're going to say before we say it, because once something is expressed, we can't take it back. So with the squares to Pluto and the Mars trine Jupiter, this takes us up through the middle of the month. Remember, the Sun actually sextiles Mars on the 13th. And on the 14th, very importantly, almost glossed over this one, on the 14th, Venus, which has on the new moon was on 26, almost 27 degrees of Aries. We're moving this a minute at a time. Let's go back to noon here. All right, so let's catch ourselves up a little bit here. We're still looking at the new moon day. And as we move ahead, we can see the moon moves into Taurus on the 12th. And actually, the moon becomes the first of several planets that will conjoin Uranus in Taurus and then square Saturn in Aquarius. Eventually, they'll all square Jupiter in Aquarius also, but that's next month. That we don't get to that until May. But we can see here that the moon has moved into Taurus, and it will by the 13th, 14th. It will actually catch up with Uranus and then square Saturn. But as we move this through the 13th and the 14th, we can see on the 14th, Venus moves from Aries into Taurus. And we're seeing the beginning of the shift of the energy from impulsive, spontaneous, kind of in-your-face Aries to dogged, determined, slow down and get there. This is the classic tortoise and the hare being Aries, that has a great ability to start the race and then take a little nap, while the tortoise just kind of, the Taurus or the bull. I know the tortoise and the bull are not the same energy, but they have that same kind of plodding, determined, they'll get there. The tortoise beats the hare because it just keeps moving forward. And when Venus moves into Taurus, Venus likes being in Taurus. We've come from Venus having been exalted in Pisces. She loves being in Pisces. Then in Aries, she's not as happy. She's really in her detriment because it's opposite her other home sign, Libra. Aries is. But when Venus gets to Taurus, this is her primary home sign. So she's happy to be at home, and yet she's going to catch up with Uranus. And that happens on the 20, where did that go? On the 22nd, but I don't think she's quite as thrilled as having to catch up with Uranus, because it's disruptive and explosive and it's new and it's different. And it's almost like a flavor of that Aries energy again. But nevertheless, Venus, when she shifts into Taurus, this is the next phase. First, it was the moon, which will be out of Taurus by the 15th. But then we'll see quickly the Mercury and the Sun will both move into Taurus. In fact, Mercury moves in on the 19th, and the Sun moves in later on the 19th. They're actually conjoining. They're pretty close to conjunct on that day. So let's move this ahead a day to the 15th. Also on the 14th, I mentioned this when we first started, that Mars is forming a half square with Uranus. And so this is a bit discomforting, a bit of kind of something unusual, something erratic, something unexpected possibly occurring. On the 15th, we have the sun making that sextile to Jupiter. I mentioned that earlier. On the 16th, the sun makes a square to Pluto. This is a deepening of the energy. And again, those power struggles can come to the surface. But if we're willing to stay with it and hold our position and not just blow energy off the top, this can be very productive, especially because Mars is making that trine to Jupiter on the 16th. And then Mercury makes its sextiles to both Jupiter and Mars on the 17th. We can see all this happening here. There's the Mars trine Jupiter and the Mercury and Sun. You can see this blue triangle is a bit stronger now than it was. We can also see this green line appearing between Mars and Pluto, which is exact on the 17th, and that's a quincunx. And this is a bit of an annoyance now. You know, we have this energy of Mars that can be very fragmented and very ready to move, and Pluto in Capricorn is much more calculating as to what it does and what it doesn't do, and there can be a little bit of discomfort, annoyance between how we express our physical energy, how we assert, how we defend our boundaries, how we maybe make boundaries that are unnecessary to make, which maybe annoys or pisses someone off, and that creates a bit of a problem. But through this period of time, the 16th and 17th, we then have Mercury also moving into that square with Pluto. Remember, the Sun squared Pluto back on the 16th, Mercury squares Pluto on the 17th. And Venus squared Pluto back on the 11th. So we have this underlying issue here of power struggle, of relentless, unforgiving kind of a potency that just won't die. It's not, it's mutating, it's in the shadows, it's in the unconscious. We try to shine the light on it, but when we shine the light on it, it goes somewhere else into another shadow. It's hard to resolve this energy. On the 18th, we have the Mercury catching up with the sun, and you can see that by the 19th, Mercury jumps to the other side of the sun and it enters Taurus, as I mentioned before. On the 19th, we have Mars making that square and a half with Saturn. Mars is not a happy camper right around this period of time, even though it's just had this a few days of exuberance with Jupiter. It then makes the quincunx with Pluto and then makes the sesqui-square with Saturn. And Mars is kind of, I think, suffering a bit. Maybe Mars is tired and worn out from running around in circles and not getting anywhere. But remember, Mars is getting really close to moving into Cancer, which it does on April 23rd. And that settles the energy quite a bit. But I think right now we're a little frazzled as we get to the 19th, and with Mars making that square and a half to Saturn. And then later on the 19th, you can see at noon, the sun was at 29 Aries and 56 minutes. So just a few minutes of Earth time afternoon, the sun moves from Aries into Taurus. Actually, it's at 1:30 Pacific time. The sun moves into Taurus. And now, by the time that sun moves into Taurus, what happened to all that fire starting, impulsive, get it going energy of Aries? It's now all kind of settled into Taurus, where it's saying, all right, I'm not going to get there overnight. I'm not going to sprint to the finish line. Instead, I need to start thinking about marathon energy rather than sprint energy. And I'm going to get there, but I need to slow it down so that it lasts, because if I persist, that will get us there. I can't just give up. I can't be the hare and fall asleep in the middle of the race. On the 20th, Venus also makes a half square with Neptune. Again, there's a bit of fantasy energy here that kind of comes into the picture. I don't think this is a hugely significant piece, but on the 22nd, that's when Venus catches up with Uranus. Now we're looking down here where Venus on the 20th is at 7.5 degrees of Taurus. Venus is moving pretty steadily right now. And by the 22nd, actually late on the 22nd, so here you can see that Venus is at 9 degrees 55 minutes at noon of and Uranus is at 10 degrees 13 minutes. So it's almost a quarter of a degree away. But by the time we move to the 23rd, we will see that um, that the Venus Uranus will already be in the past. You can see that Venus swaps sides, catches up with Uranus. But look, Mercury right behind it is coming into Uranus. And the other thing is that, as I said earlier, on the 23rd, Mars moves into Cancer. Traditionally, Mars doesn't like being in Cancer. I mean, it's exalted in Capricorn, so it's in its fall in Cancer. Theoretically, it's the feisty, fiery energy, the aggressive energy of Mars in a nurturing and maternal place, and so I think this is a good example of a patriarchal bias because I've known many people with Mars in Cancer, and their Marses are absolutely fully functional. They just aren't necessarily eager to go to war, but they will defend their home and their family and their values and their their homeland even. And so that Mars in Cancer can certainly be fierce, but it's not the outgoing macho kind of beat 'em up preemptively that Mars may be when it is in Aries. Nevertheless, I think this is a calmer Mars than it's been in Gemini. You know, for the past month and a half or so, Mars in Gemini has been, talking tough. That's what Mars in Gemini does. But in Cancer, I think we shift gears and we think more about caring and nurturing, and there is a little bit of maybe overprotective paranoia that can occur with Mars in Cancer. But this is actually a shift that traditionally isn't necessarily good, but I think that this is actually something that we really need, and it's something that will be quite healthy. By the 23rd, Mercury is also catching up with Taurus. It does it late on the day of the 23rd. It's actually 11:41 p.m. in the Pacific time. So if I move this to the 24th, and we watch down here where there's now the Sun, Mercury, Uranus, and Venus, we will see that Mercury and Uranus swap places because Mercury, moving faster than Uranus, actually conjoins that. And again, this is erratic electric breakthrough energy. We're excited, we're excitable, we're also a bit unstable. We might be jumping to conclusions. We might be answering questions before they're asked, only to find that we've answered a wrong question. And yet at the same time, on this same day, we also have Venus forming a square with Saturn, followed by Mercury forming a square with Saturn the following day. And if you remember, I said earlier, we have the Uranian energy that's irrepressible, breakthrough, explode, revolution, let's go for it, make it happen, unexpected stuff, followed by the pulling in the reins, whoa, the let's figure out how we can pull this back and make this real. And that occurs on the 24th and 25th, as first Venus and then Mercury both form their square with Saturn. And then that brings us to the 25th, when Mercury, actually moving faster than Venus, will actually catch up with Venus. And you can see here on the 25th, they're both at 13 degrees. And the actual conjunction is a little later in the day. So it won't be until we hit the 26th that we actually can see how Mercury swaps places and jumps ahead of Venus. But we also now have the moon on the 26th having moved into Scorpio mid-morning on the west coast of the United States. The moon moves into Scorpio, and as that moon moves into Scorpio, she is heading toward a Scorpio full moon, and that Scorpio full moon occurs at 8:31 p.m. Pacific time. That's 11:31 Eastern time. And let's get the chart up for that full moon. So we are now looking at the chart for the Scorpio full moon at 7 degrees of Scorpio and 6 minutes. I'm going to add the aspects of the moon back in here so we can see how the moon is situated. Obviously, we see that the full moon is opposing the sun, as it always does. This full moon, though, is also opposing Uranus because the sun is only 3 degrees away from its conjunction to Uranus, and the sun's conjunction with Uranus is exact on April 30th. So we're still 3.5 days away from the sun-Uranus conjunction, but the moon will oppose Uranus just maybe 6 hours after the full moon itself. And so the full moon in Scorpio is actually the Buddha full moon. This is the complex feelings and intensity and passion and transformation. This is Buddha's enlightenment, not only his birth, but this is about the transformation of consciousness. And the thing is that the moon is opposing the Taurus sun, and as complex and mysterious and dark, shadowy, hidden, occulted as the Scorpio moon is, it's reflecting the simplicity and the sensibility, the sensuality. I don't mean sexuality, I mean the feeling of the senses themselves, the touch, the taste, the smell, the feeling of things, which is the sensation of Taurus, and yet the complexity of that Scorpio full moon is reflecting that. And in all of this, we have the full moon, even though it's technically a 5-degree orb, it's square Saturn, and that square to Saturn is brought in by all the other planets in Taurus, because we have the Uranus 2 degrees, almost 2.5 degrees orb of square to Saturn, and the Venus, which is a little bit over 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and Mercury, which is like almost 4 degrees. And so all of these indicate this dynamic power play, this structure between the authority, and it can be a false authority, but it's the dominance of the regulations, the rules, the law, the parents, the police, the government, anyone, anything in control, the tradition. And yet that energy in Taurus is very steadily, not comfortably, but steadily looking to break out of those restraints because of the sun's approach to its conjunction to Uranus. And the moon in Scorpio is saying, yeah, all the stuff that's going on the surface, you don't know the half of it, because the real magic, the real transformation, the real metamorphosis, the real birthing of the phoenix from the egg that was burned in the fires of the ashes of the runes of destruction, that's all happening out of sight. Very powerful, powerful full moon. And the other thing, though, that's very interesting is that Neptune is also forming a half square to the sun and a square and a half to the full moon, and that's pretty darn close. That's a very close orb within a degree. And therefore, again, I think we're battling the fantasy. We're battling the illusion of what people are saying are true is true, or what we're believing is true. In some ways, there's this potential for things to come to the surface once again that have to do with the difference between what's real and what's imagined. On the 27th, Mercury makes a half square to Mars, and that Mars-Mercury half square, it can just be the expression of angry words. It can be ego skirmishes. It's not a major big deal, but I think that when you add the fact that Pluto is stationary retrograde, and I said at the beginning before we began looking at charts, that Pluto is the first of the planets that turns retrograde, and Pluto technically turns retrograde on April 27th. But, you know, when Pluto moves so slowly, that Pluto is barely going to move for days. If we back this up 24 hours, it's still at 2648. If we back it up 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, we're now back to April 20th. So it takes over a week for that Pluto to move 1/60th of a degree. And so even though Pluto is technically stationary and then turns retrograde on the 27th at 26 degrees and 48 minutes, it stays that way at that same degree and minute until May 5th. It's not until May 6th that it actually moves 1 minute of arc. So to say that Pluto turns retrograde, it's a technical way of stating it. The fact of the matter is that Pluto is holding its position now. Pluto ain't moving. And that's extremely important because we have Venus coming into a trine with Pluto. Let's back this. That's exact actually on May 5th. I think it's it's on May 5th that's exact. But let's back this up to where we were on the 27th. And what's interesting here is that both Mercury and Venus will form trines with that stationary Pluto the beginning of May. And Pluto gains even more power when it is stationary. We end the month with the sun catching up with Uranus. I mentioned that at the very beginning also. But remember that sun first conjuncts Uranus, and then a few days later, let's just move that forward a little bit, the sun will actually then square Saturn on May 3rd. We'll talk more about that on the mid-month update and also at the in the May forecast. But once again, we end the month with the same damn issue. It's Edna St. Vincent Millay, American poet, wrote, life is not one thing after another. It's the same damn thing over and over again. Well, this Saturn square Uranus, which is with us, as I said at the very beginning, throughout the entire year. We end the month with the sun conjuncting Uranus, breaking through to the other side, the new, the exciting, the revolutionary, the progressive, we're really going somewhere, the loosening of the shackles, and then boom, we have the sun square Saturn just a few days later, and now we have to negotiate with the givers of reality, those who define what is, and we're not quite as free as we might have thought we were, but that's the dance that we're playing all through the year. So April, kind of exciting, certainly not as complicated as any month in 2020, starting with January, February, March, April, May, every one of them. They were all complicated. They were all overwhelming. Even the beginning of this year, with Saturn and Uranus and Jupiter and that whole play with the energies of the squares from Mercury and retrogrades, all of that through January and February. We might as well still have been in 2020. But as we moved into March, we actually began getting some distance from that. April will be more of that. And yet there will be some throwbacks because of the re-stimulation of the Saturn Uranus square, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. But I'm guardedly optimistic as I look ahead to April, and I kind of see that we're just moving again into new territory, and we start off like running like hell, only to find that we're not ready to start yet, and then we hit the new moon in Aries. We're released, things go ahead, but then as the planets start piling up in Taurus, we slow down because we realize that we're not just going to sprint to the finish line. We have to make a plan. We have to then follow our plan, execute it, so that we can actually be around for the long haul. And we end the month with that Sun conjunct Uranus, again, another breakthrough, only to find the first week in May that maybe we spoke prematurely and that we still have some work to do. That was like an instant replay, a recap of the whole month in a paragraph. That's it. Thank you again and again and again for all of you who support this work on Patreon. For those of you who don't, patreon.com/Rick Levine. And whether you throw in $1 a month or more, depending upon what you are interested in receiving. I've been doing these cosmic interviews, and normally they go out only to the people at the $10 a month level at the planetary tier. But this month I made, or this week, I just made the cosmic interview with Gemini Brett public. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, the link is here, and it's also available on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and everywhere else. That's it. Happy April, hopefully, and happy Aries season. I wouldn't be doing my job fully if I didn't remind everyone of my Aries aphorism, since it is the Aries time of year. And I'll end with it. And it is ready, fire, aim. Think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine. See you all online soon enough.